Welcome back to Footnotes and Folly. I am Pemberton. This is part 28. The new Athenian democracy is tested at once. Cleomenes of Sparta marches in and is besieged on the Acropolis. The Boeotians and the men of Chalcis attack, and are beaten in a single day. Then Herodotus unrolls the long, strange feud between Athens and Aegina. Kneeling images of olive wood, a massacre, and a swarm of women's dress bins. And at Sparta the allies are summoned to put the tyrant Hippias back into Athens by force until Socles of Corinth rises and, with the dreadful tale of Sitalus and Periander, shames them all out of it. Hippias, refused, goes east to the Persians at Sardis, carrying his grudge to the great king's door. Let us continue.
When the Athenian envoys returned to their own land, they were strongly censured. Meanwhile Cleomenes, thinking that the Athenians had treated him outrageously both in words and in deeds, began gathering an army from the whole Peloponnese. He did not declare the purpose for which he was gathering it, but he wanted to take vengeance on the people of the Athenians and intended to make Isagoras despot, for Isagoras too had come out of the Acropolis together with Cleomenes. Cleomenes entered Eleusis with a large army. At the same time, by agreement with him, the Boeotians captured Oino and Hyce, the demes lying on the extreme borders of Attica, while the Chalcidians on the other side invaded and began ravaging various districts of Attica. The Athenians, though attacked from more than one side, decided that they would remember the Boeotians and Chalcidians later, and drew themselves up against the Peloponnesians who were in Eleusis. Just as the armies were about to join battle, the Corinthians first considered among themselves that they were not acting rightly, changed their minds, and departed. After them Demaratus, son of Ariston, did the same. He was king of the Spartans together with Cleomenes, had joined with him in leading the army out from Lacedaemon, and had not previously been at variance with Cleomenes. Because of this dissension a law was established at Sparta that, when an army went out, both kings should not be allowed to go with it. Until then both had usually gone with the army. And just as one of the kings was released from service, so also one of the sons of Tyndarus was to be left behind. Before this time both of these two had been called on by them for help and had gone with the armies. At this time in Eleusis, the rest of the allies saw that the kings of the Lacedaemonians did not agree and that the Corinthians had abandoned their place in the ranks, and they too departed and quickly made their way off. This was the fourth time that the Dorians had come to Attica. Twice they had invaded it to make war against it, and twice to help the mass of the Athenian people. The first time was when they also colonized Megara. This expedition may rightly be placed in the time when Codrus was king of the Athenians. The second and third times were when they came on expeditions from Sparta to drive out the sons of Pisistratos. The fourth was this occasion, when Cleomenes at the head of the Peloponnesians invaded Eleusis. Thus the Dorians invaded Athens then for the fourth time. After this army broke up ingloriously, the Athenians, wishing to avenge themselves, first made an expedition against the Chalcidians. The Boeotians came to the Euripus to help the Chalcidians. When the Athenians saw those who had come to help, they decided to attack the Boeotians before the Chalcidians. They engaged the Boeotians in battle, gained a great advantage over them, killed very many, and took 700 of them captive. On that same day the Athenians crossed over into Euboea and fought the Chalcidians as well. Having conquered them too, they left 4,000 holders of allotments on the land belonging to the breeders of horses, for the wealthier Chalcidians were called the breeders of horses. As many of the Chalcidians as they took captive they kept in confinement together with the captured Boeotians, bound in fetters. After a time they released them, setting their ransom at 2 pounds of silver each. But the fetters in which they had been bound they hung up on the Acropolis. These still existed in my time, hanging on walls that had been scorched by fire from the mead, directly opposite the sanctuary that faces west. They also dedicated a 10th part of the ransom as an offering, and made from it a bronze 4-horse chariot, which stands on the left as one enters the Propylaea on the Acropolis. On it is an inscription saying that the sons of Athens matched themselves in deeds of war against the tribes of Boeotia and Chalcis, conquered and tamed them in battle, quenched their insolent spirit in iron chains and darkness, and presented these things to Athene as a tithe from their ransom. So the Athenians increased in power. It is clear not from one instance only but in every way that equality is an excellent thing. For while the Athenians were ruled by despots, they were no better in war than any of those who lived around them. But after they had rid themselves of despots, they became by far the first. This proves that while they were held down they were willingly slack, because they were working for a master. But once they had been set free, each man was eager to achieve something for himself. These then were the circumstances of the Athenians. After this, the Thebans said to the god, wishing to take vengeance on the Athenians. But the Pythian prophetess said that vengeance was not possible for them by their own strength alone, and told them to report the matter to the many, voiced and ask help from those nearest to them. When those sent to consult the oracle returned, they held a general assembly and reported the oracle. Hearing that they were to ask help from those nearest to them, the Thebans said that surely those who lived nearest to them were the men of Tanagra, Coronia, and Thespe. These always fought zealously on their side and endured the war with them to the end, so what need was there to ask them? Perhaps, they said, this was not the meaning of the oracle. While they were interpreting it in this way, at last someone perceived what the oracle meant to tell them. Asopos, he said, was said to have had 2 daughters born to him, Thebe and Aegina, and since these were sisters, he thought the god had answered that they should ask the men of Aegina to become their helpers. Since no better opinion seemed to be expressed, they immediately sent and asked the men of Aegina to help them, calling on them in accordance with the oracle. When the Thebans made this request, the Aeginetans said that they sent the sons of Iacchos with them to help. After this the Thebans, having made an attempt with the alliance of the sons of Iacchos and having been roughly handled by the Athenians, sent again, gave the sons of Iacchos back, and asked instead for men. The Aeginetans, exalted by great prosperity and remembering an old grudge against the Athenians then, at the request of the Thebans, began a war against the Athenians without notice. While the Athenians were intent on the Boeotians, the Aeginetans sailed to Attica with ships of war, devastated Phaleron and many demes in the rest of the coast region, and by doing so deeply stirred the resentment of the Athenians. The grudge that the Aeginetans already owed to the Athenians had its beginning in this way. The land of the Epidaurians yielded no fruit to its inhabitants. Because of this disaster, the Epidaurians went to inquire at Delphi, and the Pythian prophetess told them to set up images of Damia and Auxesia, saying that when they had set them up, they would meet with better fortune. The Epidaurians then asked whether they should make the images of bronze or stone. The prophetess told them to use neither, but to make them from the wood of a cultivated olive tree. So the Epidaurians asked the Athenians to allow them to cut an olive tree for themselves, since they thought the Athenian olives were the most sacred. Some even say that at that time there were no olives anywhere on earth except at Athens. The Athenians said they would allow it on condition that every year the Epidaurians bring due offerings to Athene Polias and to Erechtheus. The Epidaurians agreed to these terms, obtained what they asked for, made images out of these olive trees, and set them up. Their land bore fruit, and they continued to fulfill toward the Athenians what they had agreed to do. During this time and before it, the Aeginetans were subject to the Epidaurians, and among other things they used to cross over to Epidaurus to have their disputes with one another settled by law. But after this time they built ships for themselves and revolted from the Epidaurians, moved by willfulness. Since they were at variance with them, they continued to damage them, for they had command of the sea, and especially they stole away from them the images of Damia and Auxesia. They brought the images and set them up in the inland part of their own country, at a place called Oia, about 20 furlongs from their city. Having set them up there, they worshipped them with sacrifices and choruses of women accompanied by scurrilous jesting, with 10 men appointed for each of the deities to provide the choruses. The choruses spoke evil of no man, but only of the women of the place. The Epidaurians also had the same rights, and they have rights too that may not be revealed. After these images had been stolen, the Epidaurians no longer continued to fulfill toward the Athenians what they had agreed. The Athenians therefore sent and expressed displeasure to the Epidaurians. The Epidaurians declared that they were doing no wrong. While they had the images in their own country, they had continued to fulfill what they had agreed, but since they had been deprived of them, it was not just that they should keep making the offerings. They told the Athenians to demand them from the men of Aegina, who had the images. So the Athenians sent to Aegina and demanded the images back, but the Aeginetans said they had nothing to do with the Athenians. The Athenians report that after this demand, the citizens sent by the state were dispatched in a single trireme. When they came to Aegina, they tried to tear the images from their pedestals, saying that the images were made of wood belonging to the Athenians, so that they might carry them back. Since they could not take hold of them in this way, they threw ropes around them and began pulling. Suddenly, as they pulled, thunder came on, and an earthquake came at the same time as the thunder. Because of these things the crew of the trireme who were pulling were driven out of their senses. Brought into this condition, they killed one another as if they were enemies, until only one man of the whole number was left, and he returned alone to Phaleron. This is how the Athenians report that it happened. But the Aeginetans say that the Athenians did not come with a single ship, for they could easily have repelled one ship, or even a few more than one, even if they had not happened to have ships of their own. Instead, they say the Athenians sailed against their country with a large fleet, and the Aeginetans gave way before them and did not fight a sea battle. They cannot say with certainty whether they gave way because they admitted they were not strong enough to fight by sea, or because they intended to do the very thing that they actually did. The Athenians, they say, since no one met them in battle, landed from their ships and went toward the images. Unable to tear them from their pedestals, they finally threw ropes around them and began to pull, until the images, as they were being pulled, did the same thing to both of them. Here the Aeginetans report something I cannot believe, though some other man may. They say the images fell on their knees before them, and have remained in that position ever since. While the Athenians were doing this, the Aeginetans, having learned that the Athenians were about to make an expedition against them, got the Argives to help them. Just when the Athenians had disembarked on Aegineton land, the Argives had come to their rescue. Passing over from Epidaurus to the island without being seen, they fell upon the Athenians before these had heard anything of the matter, secretly cutting them off from the way to their ships. At that moment, the thunder and the earthquake came upon them. This is the report given by both the Argives and the Aeginetans, and the Athenians also admit that only one of their men survived and returned to Attica. The Argives say that this one man remained alive after they had destroyed the Athenian force, while the Athenians say that divine power was the destroyer. Yet even this one man did not remain alive, but but perished, they say, in the following way. When he returned to Athens, he reported the calamity that had happened. The wives of the men who had gone on the expedition to Aegina heard this, and were deeply indignant that he alone of all the men had survived. They gathered around him and began stabbing him with the breeches of their mantles, each one asking him where her husband was. In this way he was killed. To the Athenians, the deed of the women seemed even more terrible than the disaster that had happened. Not knowing, it is said, how else to punish the women, they changed their fashion of dress to that of Ionia. Before this, the women of the Athenians wore Dorian dress, very like that of Corinth. They therefore changed it to the linen tunic, so that they would have no use for brooches. In truth, however, this style of dress is not originally Ionian, but Carian, for the old Hellenic fashion of dress for women was everywhere the same as what we now call Dorian. It is also said that, because of these events, the Argives and Aeginetans made it a custom in both their countries to have brooches made half as large again as the size then in established use. Their women were especially to offer brooches in the temple of these goddesses, and they were also to bring neither Athenian pottery nor anything else of Athenian manufacture to the temple. From then on, the custom was to drink there from pitchers made in their own lands. From that time onward, because of the quarrel with the Athenians, the women of the Argives and Aeginetans continued to wear brooches larger than before, and they still do so even in my own time. The origin of the enmity of the Athenians toward the Aeginetans came about in the way that has been described. So at this time, when the Thebans invaded them, the Aeginetans readily came to the aid of the Boeotians, remembering what had happened concerning the images. As I have said, the Aeginetans were laying waste the coast regions of Attica. When the Athenians had resolved to make an expedition against the Aeginetans, an oracle came to them from Delphi. It told them to wait 30 years, reckoned from the time of the wrong done by the Aeginetans, and in the 31st year to appoint a sacred enclosure for Iacchos, and then begin the war against the Aeginetans. If they did this, they would succeed as they wished. But if they made an expedition against them at once, they would in the meantime suffer much evil and also inflict much, though in the end they would subdue them. When the Athenians heard this report, they appointed a sacred enclosure for Iacchos, the one now established close to the marketplace. But they could not endure being told that they must wait 30 years, when they had suffered injuries from the Aeginetans. While they were preparing to take vengeance, however, a matter arose from the Lacedaemonians that hindered them. The Lacedaemonians had learned what had been contrived by the Alcmonidae with respect to the Pythian prophetess, and what the Pythian prophetess had contrived against themselves and the sons of Pisistratos. They were grieved for 2 reasons. First, because they had driven into exile men who were their guests, friends, and second, because after they had done this, no gratitude was shown to them by the Athenians. In addition to this, they were urged on by oracles, saying that they would suffer many injuries from the Athenians. They had not known these oracles before, but came to know them because Cleomenes had brought them to Sparta. In fact, Cleomenes had obtained from the Acropolis of the Athenians the oracles that the sons of Pisistratos had formerly possessed and had left in the temple when they were driven out. Cleomenes recovered them after they had been left behind. At this time, then, the Lacedaemonians had recovered the oracles and saw that the Athenians were increasing in power and were not at all willing to submit to them. They observed that the Athenian race, now that it was free, was becoming a match for their own, whereas when it was held down by despots it had been weak and ready to be ruled. Perceiving all this, they sent for Hippias son of Pisistratos to come from Sicyon on the Hellespont, where the family of Pisistratos had gone for refuge. When Hippias came at their summons, the Spartans also sent for envoys from their other allies. Allies, we are conscious within ourselves that we have not acted rightly. Incited by counterfeit oracles, we drove into exile men who were very closely joined to us as guests, friends, and who undertook to make Athens submissive to us. After doing this, we handed the state over to a thankless populace. As soon as this populace had lifted its head, having been freed by our means, it drove out us and our king with wanton outrage. Now, exalted with pride, it is increasing in power, so that the nearest neighbors of these men, first of all the Boeotians and Chalcidians, have already learned their error, and perhaps some others too will later learn it. Since we erred in doing the things of which we have spoken, we will now try to take vengeance on them, going there together with you. For this very purpose we sent for Hippias, whom you see here, and for you also, to come from your cities, so that with common counsel and a common force we might conduct him to Athens and give back to him what we formerly took away. So the Lacedaemonians spoke, but the majority of the allies did not approve of their words. The others kept silent, but Socles the Corinthian spoke. He said that surely now heaven would be below the earth would be lifted high above heaven, men would have their dwelling in the sea, and fish would have the place where men had lived before, since the Lacedaemonians were doing away with free governments and preparing to bring despotism back again into the cities, though there was nothing among men more unjust or more murderous. If they truly thought it good for cities to be ruled by despots, then they should first set up a despot in their own state, and only afterward try to establish despots for others. As it was, they were acting unfairly toward their allies, since they themselves had no experience of despots, and took the greatest care at Sparta that such a thing should never happen. If they had experienced it, as the Corinthians had, they would be able to offer juster opinions about it than they now did. Socles then told how the Corinthian state had once been ordered. The government was an oligarchy, and the oligarchs, who were called Bacchiadi, controlled the state and made marriages among themselves. One of these men, named Amphion, had a daughter who was lame, and her name was Labda. Since none of the Bacchiad I wished to marry her, she was taken as wife by Aetion, son of Echecrates, who was of the deme of Petra, though by original descent he was a Lapith, and of the race of Caeneus. No children were born to him, either from this wife or from another. Therefore he set out to Delphi to inquire about offspring. As he entered, the prophetess at once addressed him in verses, saying that he was much to be honored, though no one gave him honor, that Labda had conceived, and would bear a rolling rock that would fall in ruin on the heads of the kings and visit Corinthos with punishment. This answer given to Aetion was somehow reported to the Bacchiadae. The oracle that had earlier come to Corinth had not been intelligible to them, though it referred to the same matter as the oracle of Aetion. It said that an eagle had conceived in the rocks and would bear a ravening lion, strong and fierce to devour, who would loosen the knees of many, and it bade the Corinthians, whose dwelling lay around fair Paran's spring and craggy Corinthos, ponder this well in their minds. This earlier oracle had been obscure to the Bacchiadae, but afterward, when they heard the answer given to Aetion, they immediately understood that the former oracle agreed with Aetion's. Understanding this too, they kept quiet, because they wished to destroy the child that would be born to Aetion. As soon as his wife bore a child, they sent 10 of their own number to the deme where Aetion lived, to kill the child. When these men came to Petra, and entered the courtyard of Aetion's house, they asked for the child. Labda knew nothing of the purpose for which they had come, and supposed they were asking for the child out of friendly feeling toward its father, so she brought it and placed it in the hands of one of them. They had resolved on the way that the first man who received the child should dash it on the ground. But when Labda brought it and gave it to him, by divine providence the child smiled at the man who had received it. When he saw this, a feeling of pity kept him from killing it. In pity he handed it to the next man, and that man to the third. So the child passed through the hands of all 10, given from one to another, since none of them could bring himself to destroy its life. They gave the child back to its mother and went outside. Then, standing by the doors, they abused and blamed one another, especially the man who had first received the child, because he had not done what had been resolved. At last, after some time, they decided to go in again and all share in the murder. But from the offspring of Aetion it was destined that evils should spring up for Corinth. Labda had been standing near the door and heard all this. Afraid that they would change their mind, take the child a second time, and kill it, she carried it away and hid it in the place that seemed to her least likely to be discovered, a corn chest. She was sure that if they returned and searched, they would probably examine everything, and this in fact happened. They came in and searched, but failed to find the child, so they thought it best to return and tell those who had sent them that they had done everything they had been ordered to do. They departed, and said this. Afterward the son of Aetion grew up, and because he had escaped this danger, he was given the surname Kypselos, derived from the corn chest. When Kypselos had grown to manhood, and was seeking divination, a two-edged answer was given to him at Delphi. Trusting in this, he made an attempt on Corinth, and took possession of it. The answer was this: Happy is the lot of the man who enters the god's house, offspring of Aetion, who shall rule in famous Corinthos, Kypselos himself and his sons, but his children's children no longer. Such was the oracle. When Kypselos became despot, he was a man of this character. Many Corinthians he drove into exile, many he deprived of their wealth, and very many more he deprived of their lives. After Kypselos had reigned for 30 years and brought his life to a prosperous end, his son Periander succeeded him in the despotism. At first Periander was milder than his father, but after he had dealings through messengers with Thrasybulos, the despot of Miletus, he became far more murderous even than Kypselos. He sent a messenger to Thrasybulos and asked what settlement of affairs would be safest for him to make, so that he might best govern his state. Thrasybulos led the messenger from Periander out of the city and entered a field of growing corn. As he passed through the crop, repeatedly questioning the messenger about the reason for his coming from Corinth, he kept cutting off the heads of those ears of corn that he saw standing higher than the rest. As he cut off their heads, he threw them away, until in this way he had destroyed the finest and richest part of the crop. After passing through the place and giving no word of advice, he dismissed the messenger. When the messenger returned to Corinth, Periander was eager to hear what counsel had been given. But the messenger said that Thrasybulos had given him no counsel, and added that he wondered at Periander for sending him to such a man, since the man was out of his senses and a waster of his own goods, and he related what he had seen Thrasybulos do. Periander understood what had been done, and perceived that Thrasybulos was advising him to put to death those who were eminent among his subjects. From then on he began to show every kind of evil treatment toward the citizens of the state. Whatever Kypselos had left undone in killing and driving into exile, Periander completed. In one day he stripped all the wives of the Corinthians of their clothing because of his own wife Melissa. He had sent messengers to the Dysprosians on the river Acron to ask the oracle of the dead about a deposit entrusted to him by a guest friend. Melissa appeared and said that she would not tell where the deposit had been placed, because she was cold and had no clothes. The garments he had buried with her were of no use, since they had not been burned. She said this would be proof to him that she spoke the truth. When the oven was cold, Periander had put his loaves into it. When this report was brought back to Periander, the sign convinced him, because he had had intercourse with Melissa after she was dead. Immediately after receiving the message, he caused a proclamation to be made that all the wives of the Corinthians should come out to the temple of Hera. They came as if to a festival, wearing their finest adornment. But Periander had set the spearmen of his guard in ambush, and he stripped them all alike, both the free women and their attendants. Having gathered all their clothes into a pit, he set fire to them, praying at the same time to Melissa. After he had done this, and sent a second time, the apparition of Melissa told him the place where he had laid the deposit entrusted to him by his guest friend. Such a thing, Lacedaemonians, is despotism, and such are its deeds. We Corinthians greatly marveled at first when we saw that you were sending for Hippias, and now we marvel even more because you say these things. We adjure you, calling upon the gods of Hellas, not to establish despotisms in the cities. But if you will not cease from your design, and if you try to restore Hippias contrary to what is just, know that the Corinthians at least do not consent to what you are doing. Socles, the envoy of Corinth, spoke in this way. Hippias answered him, calling the same gods as witnesses, and said that the Corinthians would surely regret the loss of the sons of Pisistratos more than all others, when the appointed days came for them to be troubled by the Athenians. Hippias answered in this way because he knew the oracles more exactly than any other man. The rest of the allies, who for a time had restrained themselves and kept silent, heard Socles speak freely. Then each of them gave voice to what he felt and adopted the opinion of the Corinthian envoy, adjuring the Lacedaemonians not to do violence to a city of Hellas. Thus this matter came to an end. Hippias was dismissed from there. Amydus, king of the Macedonians, offered him Anthemus, and the Thessalians offered him Iolcos, but he accepted neither. Instead he withdrew again to Sicyon, the city that Pisistratos had taken by force of arms from the Mytileneans. After taking possession of it, Pisistratos had appointed his own natural son Hegesistratos, born of an Argive woman, to be despot there. Hegesistratos did not keep possession without a struggle of what he had received from Pisistratos, for the Mytileneans and Athenians carried on war for a long time, with their strongholds respectively at Achilleon and Sicyon. One side demanded that the place be restored to them, while the Athenians did not admit this demand, but argued that the Aeolians had no better claim to the territory of Ilion than they and the rest of the Hellenes, as many as had joined with Menelaus in exacting vengeance for the rape of Helen. While they carried on the war, many different things happened in the battles. Once, when a fight took place, and the Athenians were winning, Alcaeus the poet fled and escaped himself, but the Athenians kept possession of his arms, and hung them on the walls of the temple of Athena at Sicyon. Alcaeus composed a song about this and sent it to Mytilene, reporting his misadventure to Melanippus, who was his friend. Finally Periander, son of Kypselos, made peace between the Athenians and the Mytileneans, for they referred the matter to him as arbitrator. He made peace between them on the condition that each side should continue to occupy the territory it then possessed. In this way Sicyon had come under the rule of the Athenians. When Hippias returned to Asia from Lacedaemon, he set everything in motion, stirring up enmity between the Athenians and Artaphernes and using every means to secure that Athens should come under the rule of himself and Darius. While Hippias was doing this, the Athenians heard of these things and sent envoys to Sardis, trying to prevent the Persians from following the suggestions of the exiled Athenians. Artaphernes, however, commanded them, if they wished to be preserved from ruin, to receive Hippias back again. The Athenians were by no means willing to accept this proposal when it was reported to them, and because they did not accept it, the common opinion among them at once became that they were enemies of the Persians.
And we will stop there, with Hippias at Sardis whispering against Athens into Persian ears, and the Athenians realizing, too late, that they have made an enemy of the most powerful man on earth. Next time, in the last part of the book, part 29, Athens and Eretrius send ships to the Ionian rebels, the Greeks burn Sardis to the ground, and Darius, hearing of it, calls for his bow. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.